Right, this is a modelled question, a 6-mark question on linking properties of materials to their use. This is quite a common question. So at the start of the question, they've got a table with all the information. It's got melting point, density, relative strength, relative heat conductivity, and cost per tonne. So if you look at the question, it says, look at the picture of a military aircraft. Only small numbers of these aircraft are made. So I'm going to underline here, aircraft and small numbers. And the reason I've underlined small is that one of these columns is to do with cost. So because you're only making small numbers of them, the cost is going to be less important. I'm just going to write that there. Okay, and because it's an aircraft, we want to think about how these properties relate to the aircraft. So melting point, so if it's an aircraft, it's going to get to high temperatures because of the friction and the air resistance. So the melting point I want to be high. The density, because it's an aircraft, they need a lot of fuel to take off. So the density is going to be important. You want the density to be low. Remember, the density is a measure of the mass per volume, so I want that to be low. Because if it's a high density, then the aircraft's going to be heavy. And that's going to mean that you're going to need a lot more fuel. So the cost of the fuel is going to be more expensive and it's going to be environmentally unfriendly. Now, when we're talking about density, we need to make sure that we don't use heavy or light. You can use, in most exam mark schemes, they'll let you get away with lightweight, but we need to make sure that we're using the proper word, which is density. Right, relative strength. It's an aircraft, so obviously we want that to be high. Heat conductivity isn't really important for this. If we were making something like a saucepan, then we'd want that to be high. I'm sorry, not important. So if it was a saucepan, we'd obviously want it to be high because when you put your food in the saucepan, you want the heat to travel to it. And the cost, we've already said, is less important. So what it wants us to do is evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each metal for making the body and wings of the military aircraft. Which metal, A, B or C, would you choose and why? So I'm going to look at each of these columns. So for melting point, I'm just going to rank them 1 to 3. So the melting point, we've said we want to be high. So that means that A is the best, then 2, and then I'm going to put a cross by B because that's a bit rubbish and we don't want that. Right, for density, so we want the lowest density. So the lowest density is number 1, and these two are about the same, so I'm going to put a cross by those. Relative strength, so C would be the best. A would be second, and then again we've got a cross by B. Relative heat conductivity, I'm going to cross that out because it's not important. And then the cost, so C would be best, then B, and then A. But we've said that cost isn't as important because we're only making small numbers. So what it wants me to do is choose which metal, A, B or C, and then explain why. So if I take each one at a time, so if I look at A, it's first for melting point and density, it's second for relative strength, and the only one that it falls down at is this cost. If I look at B, B's definitely not the one to choose because it's got the lowest melting point. It's bad for the density, so it's got a cross by all of these. It's not very strong. So the only thing it's got going for it is that it's not that expensive. So we're definitely not going to go with B. Right, if I look at C, so C's not too bad. It's number 1 for strength, and it's number 1 for cost, and number 2 for melting point. Where it falls down is this density here, it's got a cross. So if we look at that, the only one that's not got a cross is A. So A is definitely the best choice here. If you look in the mark scheme, it will give you some credit for C, but you won't be able to get your full 5 to 6 marks if you've chosen C. So if you write C and justify it, you can get 3 to 4 marks. But for full marks, we want to choose A. So now to write my answer. So it says evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each metal. So I need to talk about A, B and C for this. So I can't just say why A is great, I need to talk about all of them. So now remember, we've got this symbol here, which means the quality of written communication will be assessed in your answer to this question. So we need to be making sure we're writing in full sentences, and we need to make sure that our spelling and grammar are correct. So we can't just write this in bullet points. So it says evaluate the advantages of each metal. So I'm going to start with A. So I'm going to start with A. Excuse me while I just get this correct. Difficult to be able to see what I'm writing at the same time. Right, so A. So if we look at the table, A has a high melting point. So A has a high melting point. It has a low density. Actually, if I say A has a high melting point, I want to put which is an advantage. It has a low density, which is good for an aircraft. As it will lower the fuel costs. It is relatively, it's the second strongest. And in fact, if we go back to this, so I've put A has a highest melting point. Really what I should put for that is it has the highest melting point. And the lowest density, so it has a low density, I should change that to it has the lowest. So it has the lowest density. So it is the second strongest, which would be desirable for an aircraft. And then we talk about the disadvantage. So it is, so instead of saying it's expensive, I need to say that it's the most expensive. So it's the most expensive. But as only small amounts or small numbers of aircraft are made. This is not as important. Right, now I'm going to go with B. So if we look at B, it's pretty rubbish really. It's got the lowest melting point. It's got a high density. It's the weakest, and it's more expensive than C. So let's just get, so B would not be a good choice. As it's got the lowest boiling point. Sorry, not boiling point, lowest melting point. It has the second highest density. It is the weakest. And the second most expensive. Right, so that just leaves us with C. So as I've said, C would be a reasonable choice, but it's just not as good as A. So we need to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of C. So C would be a reasonable choice as it has a reasonably high melting point. It is the strongest, so it's the strongest, and it is the cheapest. However, it has the highest density, which would increase fuel cost. Right, so I've talked about the advantages and disadvantages of all of them there. So the last thing I need to do is it says which metal A, B or C would you choose and why. Okay, so then I just need to write a few sentences saying why, which one I think and why. So A is definitely the best. So overall, I would recommend using metal A. And if I look at that, the only disadvantage of it is cost. So I would recommend using metal A as the only disadvantage is cost. It's the best for melting point. Sorry, I'm running out of space here. So it's the best for melting point and density. Okay, that's your 6-mark question answered. So you should have a very similar question. So I want you to have a go at answering that now. Thank you.